Okay, so here we go, a video dedicated to how to deal with toxic femininity. I'm just going to throw it out there, probably get all kinds of wrath and feedback in the current climate that we live in, but screw it, it's a topic that men have been asking me about in secret, and I'm sure many men out there are wondering to themselves how to deal with this, who haven't reached out and asked or voiced the question directly yet. So how to deal with toxic femininity. I need to make a disclaimer at the start of the video. This is very, very important. Be aware, I love women. I have a great relationship to women, and I'm in a great, adult, healthy, I would say upwardly spiraling relationship with my partner of 5 years. And even in the past, by and large, I've had a good relationship to women. Now, of course, I've had to clean myself up along the way, like become aware of certain blind spots, certain ignorances of missing parts of her, not being able to listen, not having my heart open. Yeah, I mean, this path towards becoming a greater lover and a greater leader and a greater man is filled with learning about our shadow and learning how to open our hearts and develop a real empathy and connection. And it took me quite some years and work to get to that kind of place. So at the outset, this is not the typical kind of male empowerment, reinstill the patriarchy kind of channel. Everything I talk about here is all about supporting a more compassionate, healing, adoring, honoring relationship between the genders and the sexes. Okay, so we've heard a lot about the toxic masculine behavior over the years. It's worth just pausing and doing some definitions before we begin. And how I would describe toxic masculinity is that in many men in the world, we have anger, rage, hatred, accumulated frustration, hurt, disappointment, fear, and a sense of being threatened by the women of the world. So most of us have had such experiences, and where those experiences have not been healed or integrated, they live within us as this kind of simmering emotion beneath the surface, and what that does is kind of leak out the side in toxic ways. So some of the ways that toxic masculine behavior will express itself is in general kind of objectivization and sexualization of women's bodies, demeaning sexist jokes which have a tone of power game in it, kind of demeaning statements to kind of keep women under the thumb. There is, of course, sexual advances that go beyond women's consensual or actual boundaries. And then there's going back to the locker room with the rest of the guys and fist bumping and celebrating all the ways that you kind of got one over a particular woman in your life. And often this very toxic male behavior is perpetrated onto the next group of men, and you kind of coax and cajole other men to showing up in these boyish or laddish ways when they wouldn't really want to. But I don't know, that there's a weird kind of validation that some men get from some men by doing this locker room kind of frat bro kind of thing. And so in this way, which is very interesting, is that sometimes toxic masculine behavior gets passed down from boy to boy, from generation to generation, even if some big personal trauma doesn't actually happen to an individual. It's just the cultural water that many of us are swimming in, right? You could even extrapolate this even further. The toxic masculine on a wider scale is all about having a vision and a sense of power that you want to have over the world and control, and can end up in totalitarian regimes, dictatorships, rapacious capitalism, and so on, right? That's kind of the extreme end. So what is toxic femininity? Well, having been on the receiving end of everything that I've just said, and thousands of years of systemic repression and the daily violences and the daily actions that hold that sense of repression in, women also have their pockets of anger, rage, hatred, hurt, betrayal, disappointment, and feeling afraid of and threatened by men. And so much of the time, there is much of this emotion that is stuck within the body, doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't have a way of expressing itself really, so it kind of simmers unconsciously and then kind of bleeds out the side in feminine forms of behavior that we might call toxic. And so some toxic feminine behaviors, you'll kind of recognize the bitter taste if you're on the receiving end of this often, but there's a lot of snark, cynical, emasculating jokes and comments aimed at men. That's one of them. There's the very kind of extractive utilization of men for their resources. So women who might, through a huge sense of entitlement, date you once or twice, try and take as much as they can. And then if they don't want to see you anymore, they've got no qualms about being rude or disrespectful to you. It's just part of the game that they can show up that way. Also, there's all kinds of different forms of manipulation. And some men are even talking about the ongoing destruction of a man's life. And that could be in a very wild and clear way, kind of defamation cases, of course, and a lot of stuff about taking away children and lawsuits and the way that the whole legal thing is set up. There's kind of a high drama, first degree form of destruction, but there's also the subtle 50-year plus sustained waves against the rock assassination of a man's sense of self and self-confidence that you see in some marriages that have gone for many, many decades, right? There's a toxic femininity that's corrosive that does that to a man as well. And we might even say, if we take toxic femininity out of the personal, there's this sense of smothering mother that anytime that there is a threat to her being abandoned, or there's an uprising of independent male power starting to happen that makes her feel threatened, she'll try and nip that in the bud through corrosive means. So to a child, that might mean nipping away at a little boy's sense of confidence so he doesn't become autonomous and go and play outside with the other boys, so he stays home and plays with mama. Or we see this in the culture at large with council culture. So anyone who's doing anything risky or problematic, sees their positions in public institutions and, just get rid of those problematic aspects of men because they make us feel threatened. That's more global. Okay, how do I work with this in a more personal relationship level, right? Because the question that came to me is about personal relationships. And the basic advice is very, very simple. Head towards the light and only the light. There are beautiful, heartfelt, amazing women out there who have an integrated and loving perspective on men. Move towards women like that. There's also a huge number of women out there in the world who, even if they are coming from pain and heartbreak and anger and disappointment in the past, they are on a path of healing so that they can become, for themselves and then later for a man in their life, a loving and nurturing and inspiring presence. Head towards women who are heading towards the light. Head towards women who already are the light. If you see a toxic, feminine woman in your midst, head the other way, right? And a lot of the time we can kind of feel or sense a woman who is in some kind of toxic feminine behavior. We can sniff her a mile off and avert our gaze and dodge the bullet and run a mile. That's usually quite easy. But there's two problems to that. And the first one is, if your dating life comes from a sense of scarcity, like really you're dating or you're with somebody because you're really afraid to be alone, you can, of course, hold yourself to a lower standard and invite any kind of female behavior and female attitude into your life because you would prefer that to being alone, in which case you are contributing, of course, to your own downfall. The other side of this is, if you are still unconscious to certain psychological patterns, perhaps you grew up in a family where a certain amount of toxic behavior was normal, you might feel an unstoppable attraction to women who portray certain toxic personality and relationship traits, but you can't stay away from it because something feels like home. There's still that codependent, full of charge sense of attraction, and you keep going into those relationships again and again. And so at some point you will have to go inside yourself and heal some of that so you're liberated from the pull towards that toxicity. But even if that's not you, I think it's fair to say that the amount of women who are and embody the light is a small cluster, and the number of women who are permanently and perpetually and God-forsaken devils is a very small number. What we're really operating with is the 90% of humanity who are sometimes toxically feminine and sometimes good-hearted and aspiring to a good relationship in life. Just like us as men, sometimes we might let slip and act in subtly toxic ways, even though in the depths of our heart we want to create something better. And so we're all in this kind of murky world where nothing's so cut and dry. So I think that's the most important thing to honor. How to deal with this? The overarching answer is presence. We deal with toxic feminine behavior and we inspire beautiful, nurturing, vibrant, life-giving feminine behavior through presence. And to the extent that I am present, I'm going to elicit and evoke more beautiful, kind, graceful gifts from the women around me. It's just the way it is. And it's almost like the way I feel it in myself is my groundedness, the way that I am embodied, the extent to which my heart is open, my depth of awareness, all these things come together to add up to my presence, and that evokes a really kind and beautiful behavior from women. What's interesting though is I've seen this as soon as I turn my back and I can sense the same woman who's just been kind to me speak to the next man and be completely disrespectful, even bitchy to him. That's also possible. So the very same woman can act in completely different ways depending on the love, the presence, the authority that you embody. Now, should this be another way? That's an important question. Should women bestow the same kindness and graciousness that they bestow on a man who's present towards a man who is not present? You could say that that would make for a better world. You could also say that women have been conditioned into being sweet and kind to lackluster men who are not present for a long period of time, and that adds up to some of the rage and the malaise that women are feeling, and that is in the discourse nowadays. So in a sense, as a man, you do kind of get what you get. And to some extent, and I'm not going to be rigid about this, but we get a lot of the things that we deserve, or at least we attract in the behavior that we elicit through who we are ourselves. So let me break down this concept of presence and give you a few examples. And I'm going to do this by naming two different archetypes. The first archetype is the archetype of the father. So I recently had a client, and very spontaneously and all of himself, he went on a date with a beautiful young woman, and it was excellent, really nice, beautiful, connected time. A couple of days later, he's on the phone with her and he's trying to set up date number 2, and she's being cold, elusive, evasive, even disrespectful towards him. And he felt inside him this calm and mild sense of irritation. And that's a beautiful mixture, actually. There's part of me that's irritated, but I'm still calm and mild enough to not be reactive. And so he felt all this, and very spontaneously he gave it voice. And she said something to him, and he said back to her, "This is not the kind of respect that I'm looking for." Or, this is not the level of respect I'm looking for in a woman. He paused and he breathed and he just let that sit. This is not the level of respect I'm looking for. And out of that silence comes a tension, and out of that silence came a change. And what ended up happening was she completely apologized. She then set up all the arrangements for date number 2, 3, 4, and so on. And he couldn't keep her off of her for the rest of the time that they were together. And that's very interesting. And what struck me as true, particularly in the world where young women who get a lot of attention for their looks have often never heard an authoritative man with an open-hearted sense of standards, literally say, this doesn't meet my bar and what I'm looking for. And it's so rare that a few words, like a boundary, cuts through that sense of entitlement that it discombobulates her system. She's like, wow, I'm in the presence of, I didn't take him for this kind of man. I'm in the presence of someone a lot bigger and more powerful than I thought. Vroom. Okay, that does something very, very powerful to her. So setting a boundary in a clear and not a controlling way is very beautiful. And of course, if she doesn't follow the sense of boundary or the standard that you're inviting her to, then you know that it's not going to be a lot of fun having a woman like that tag along with you. Trying to lead a woman who fundamentally doesn't respect your standards is a no-go, right? So that she you would label her too toxic and just move on with your life. But she came along with him. And then the second thing that you can do from this archetype of the father is set your vision for where you see the relationship going. And you can do that with a few words like, I understand you've been hurt by men before, but not here. I want to have a relationship that is respectful, that is loving, that is nurturing. That is my vision for us. I want to have a beautiful conversation in which men and women can heal, that you and I can heal. So you're not just setting standards or boundaries or my way or the highwaying it with the women that you see and date, but you are explaining why and why that's in service to both of you. I understand that there is some pain and some frustration. I understand why there's anger. I understand you've had hurt in the past. And here in this space between you and me, I want a more compassionate conversation between men and women. And I want that because I want the best for you, the best for me. This is a place where we can heal. Again, it's important to close your mouth. You say a couple of very strong, charged sentences, and then pause and let her sit in the tension that ensues. Because it's that tension that gives the reverberations of the energy in the body an opportunity to be felt, to calm down, to integrate. And so don't explain yourself. You tell her what is necessary so that she understands you. Oh, and I want this and because this and blah, blah, blah. You don't start moving and putting on a show that she can understand more. Just let the raw energy of your one or two strong statements hit her. Energy of the father. Compassionate and benevolent. It's not controlling or imposing. The second archetype is the one of the mother, actually. It's good that men have a feminine side. We can embody the archetype a bit more of the mother. And so there's a couple of things that you can do in a moment, say, where you're receiving some feminine behavior that's a little bit toxic. You can say, it really hurts me when you say things like that. Or it hurts my heart when you say things like that about men. When you make comments about men like that, I feel a twinge of pain or a sadness. So this practice is sharing your emotional response to the way that she's showing up. And you're not saying it in a way that you're trying to control her with these statements or even make her wrong for making these statements. It's like, I hear you say this about men, or I hear you say this about my father, or I hear you saying this about your boyfriend, or I hear you saying this about the state of the men in the world. But as you say that, I feel pain in my heart. It's kind of inclusive, it's accessible. And then you sharing your emotions becomes a mirror. She can see herself a bit more accurately in. And if there's a connection, if there's some respect to you, she'll stop and start looking at herself a little bit. And then the fourth thing you can do is you can go a step further. If you feel the opportunity, you could say something like, for you to feel this way about men, I imagine that there's some hurt. Or I imagine that you've been hurt in the past. Or when you say this, I imagine you're angry about men. And you can say that and give her an opportunity to vocalize why she feels the way that she does. So there's the actions, the toxic kind of actions, the lashing out, the statements, the corrosive attitude. But underneath that, of course, is the original pockets of pain and anger. So that's what you're asking about. And if she is ready to go into one of those, or trusts you enough to go into one of those, you just sit and listen. And then she starts talking about some backstory that was never cleared up, or expressing some kind of pain or anger that's not yet been felt. Just sit there and listen with your heart wide open and a lot of compassion. Because just her sharing some of those experiences with a man who is present and willing to listen and doesn't need her to change, he's just empathetic enough to want to know the story, that itself can be a healing experience, which lowers down a lot of the anguish that lives within her, and therefore lowers down the amount of toxic behavior that stems out of that. So those are 4 things that you can do. You can just state your highest standard. You can 2, lay down a concise vision for how you want your conversation and your relationship to be. You can 3, just share your feelings, what it's like, what you feel actually when you see, witness, or on the receiving end of her toxicity. And then number 4, you can just gently and lovingly inquire, why is it that it's like that, and give her an opportunity to explore for herself and perhaps heal. So presence really is the healing balm, and to the extent that you can be present and not react in any of this, it will be successful. If there is a fundamental non-acceptance, I hate toxic femininity, I got to win this power game, I need to make her shut up so I reassert myself, any of that's happening, even 10% of that might be happening underneath the words that you speak, are going to corrode the tone of voice through which you speak any of this, and ultimately it will probably lead to a kind of conflict. Some of those conflicts might be good, but often those conflicts will just reinforce the same antipathy between men and women that existed in the first place that brought all this to a head. So you've got to do your work to find as much presence as you possibly can. And so I think there are 2 things at the core to presence here. And the first thing is, you've got to find a place, as strange as it sounds, to accept toxic feminine behavior. So all this behavior we're calling toxically feminine, you've got to find a way to accept it. That doesn't mean that you'll tolerate a lot of it coming close to your life, or even you'll have any in your relationship, or you'll choose a woman with a lot of it and have her as your partner. No. But the way in which toxic behavior and the hurt that causes it and the anger under the surface exists in this world as a global phenomenon, that has to be seen and witnessed and accepted for you to be able to have even the empathy to make your presence high enough to do the kind of things that I'm suggesting. That's why I started off with a lengthy definition of toxic masculine behavior here, so you can start to see and feel what it's been like for women for so long to be on the receiving end of some of that. So you have to have an acceptance, and then when you accept the toxic behavior, funnily enough, that's the fastest agent that makes it actually go away. And why I say father and mother is that a father and a mother are going to fundamentally accept their child even when the child acts badly. They're just not going to accept the behavior of the child. So it's like, I still love you, I still accept you, and I understand your behavior, even though I want to call you to a bit of account here and not have it happen around me. And the second thing we've got to dive into, and I'll probably go into this further in a second video because there's so many other rabbit holes of this topic to unpack, really. The second thing is to get to this state of presence when we are directly trifling with a woman whose behavior is filled with bitterness, filled with rage, is that the most helpful thing to keep our compassion in those situations is to accept and go into our own grief at the situation. Which means if I feel into the social reality in this Western world today and just how much hatred and antipathy there is between men and women, and that I somehow, on the receiving end of so many snarky comments growing up, and on the receiving end of the awful conditioning that's going on in the world, and all these memes that propagate, that try and demean and get power over each other, and all the politicized nonsense that's going on in the world. I grew up in all of that, and I have to make my way as an individual and try and scramble my way, hack and knife fight my way into having a happy experience with a partner. And all my brothers and sisters are all doing the same thing, men and women struggling to have a beautiful, vulnerable, open-hearted, truly collaborative relationship with each other. When I feel into and really understand how difficult that is for so many, I've got to let it break my heart. There's so much grief that we just can't, turn 18 years old and have the kind of loving partners we want. We're attached to our pride, and we're attached to our power. And we don't want to be frustrated, and we don't want to be ridiculed and humiliated, and we close off, and hurt gestates, and the toxicity just continues to cycle around. Yeah, I think when I speak to enough hundreds of people around the world who are struggling with these topics, it really breaks my heart. And from that place of a broken heart, I can then take on that archetype of one of the two parents and be compassionate, be strong, lay down a boundary, make her accountable to her behavior, but I'm doing it fundamentally from a grieving heart. And interestingly, it's the grief in the middle of it all that gives that sense of compassion, which is, I'm taking on your toxic behavior here, but I'm not taking on you. I'm facing down the toxicity of your behavior, but I'm doing it because I love you and I want us both to have better connections in our life. And from that depth of the heart, most of this stuff works impeccably well and creates a situation where all of your relationships, your close, intimate ones, but even the ones with your kind of cynical and broken-hearted mother, sister, and so on, if you can feel the grief of your own situation, the global situation, and their situation, then that's when some of the magic of healing happens. So those are my thoughts from a man who loves women and wants to see more true love in the world. As I said, I will make a follow-up to this, so if I've not addressed your particular questions in the midst of it, leave it in the comments below. I'll look through with interest and then line the best of the comments up as a section in the next video. I hope you've enjoyed this. Subscribe to me. My newsletter, my Substack is in the comments below, and I'm also open and available at the moment for private coaching sessions. Click through the link and book a session if you're ready.